Morning. We're going to continue on this morning, and this morning I'm thrilled to be introducing Robin Mallery, and Robin Mallery is passionate about food. During her 25 years of hospital-based cardiovascular nursing, she saw firsthand that whole food choices can enhance our state of health, and how processed and preserved foods can deplete health, leading to a disease state. Robin left the disease management model of healthcare to focus on health management. She is a committed educator and advocate for fresh and local whole foods and their contribution to optimal health and well-being. So join me in welcoming Robin.
Thank you. Good morning. My voice is okay in the back? Great. Typically not a microphone person. Thank you for choosing this workshop this morning. I'm always jazzed when I have an opportunity to talk about my favorite topics, food, nutrition, and radiant health, and that I get to tie that today to aging and wellness is just the icing on the cake, so to speak. And that would, of course, be homemade icing as opposed to that comes from a can. When we talk about aging and grace, it's something that I have become more aware of in the last few years as I'm looking straight at 60 coming right up. And what I know for sure is that when we nourish ourselves with real food, we are able to age with grace and ease. And when we make food choices that can deplete our health, we sometimes then struggle into our more mature years. So let's look at that today. Oops, got it. I had it upside down. We will be discussing the benefits of plant-based meals and looking at how to incorporate in practical and pleasing ways fresh and local whole foods into your daily meal plan. I'd like to step back for a moment and just give a little bit of a disclaimer. As I was introduced, it was evident to you likely that I had 30 years in hospital-based nursing. I started out in intensive care unit as a nurse, loved that kind of work, and for 20 years I managed a cardiac rehabilitation center in Northern California at a small community hospital. It was during that time that I realized that in our healthcare system we are very excellent at managing disease. That's where our focus is, and we have a lot of opportunity in managing health. What I found also of great interest was after the first several years in cardiac rehab, I saw my clients falling back to the very behaviors that contributed to their heart disease in the first place. So I'd meet somebody 3 weeks after an angioplasty, and they'd be sitting across from me at my desk and sometimes very emotional and in tears, telling me they'd be willing to do whatever it would take to never experience a cardiac event again. And of course, you can imagine that. And yet, as they got back into their lives, back to their families, back to work, and stress levels began to jump back in, they fell into routines that didn't serve their maintaining that state of well-being. Does that make sense? Sometimes it was overt. They'd go back to smoking because they had to learn they had to practice being more relaxed. That was their perspective. Or they got so busy they could not find time to eat real food, so they got back into the convenience food model. So I was puzzled by this and very intrigued by the fact that our healthcare system seemed to be, in a way, not able to support optimal health and well-being of these clients. It led me to Harvard Mind-Body Medicine Institute, where I took an intensive program on behavior change. And those of you who have dabbled at all in the science of behavior change is absolutely fascinating. And what I learned was about brain chemistry and how many of the choices we make are not about being having willpower, but in fact how our external environment affects the choices we make. And I decided that I could no longer serve my clients well in a disease management model. So as it was introduced, I left that, and I've been a health coach since 2008. I've lived in Evansville for almost 3 years now. I'm not working as a nurse in a hospital-based environment or any environment. I get to be a community volunteer, which I love, so I have opportunities such as this to teach every now and again, and I'm involved with several food activism organizations here in Evansville. So again, just by way of introduction, the disclaimer really is that I have some very strong opinions about our food systems and some of the information or misinformation that we are so easily given by food manufacturers and by tear-off sheets that you might get at your physician's office at your once-a-year checkup. So I'm hoping to bring some balance to some of that today. Let's talk about the return to real food. Whole food and real food, by the way, are terms that I use interchangeably, and what you eat really does matter. We have strayed off the path from that whole food or real food model. We have, in fact, become very busy. In the United States, we live a very fast-paced life, there's no doubt. We try to fit in as much as possible, and in fact, we're often judged by how productive we can be, so that just keeps us on that wheel of trying to fit more in. But in that place of being busy, we've allowed ourselves to be convinced that we don't have time to cook real food from scratch. We have been familiarized with convenience foods in a way that I believe has led to some of our chronic disease states. We'll talk about how we can bring some balance to that as well. As I look around the room, there's some mature folks close to my age, and what I want to venture is that some of you have grown up eating from your own backyards or from your own neighborhoods. In the 60s, 70s, with the advent of refrigeration and ultimately other processes that allowed for food to have extended shelf lives, some of which those processes are change the food quality quite a bit. Some of us have stepped away from seasonal food. When I walk into a grocery store and I see blueberries in January, it gives me pause. Those blueberries come from South and Central America, and there's two things to consider there when we're eating, for instance, fruits from 4,000 miles away. Those fruits or vegetables have been changed in some way so they could survive a 10-day transport system. Sometimes they use a process called irradiation, which is exposing that food to X-ray, which slows down the ripening process, and it begins to degrade the nutritional value of that food from the beginning. So there's some concerns about oxidation that occurs inside of our own bodies. You're familiar with the term oxidation? It's kind of a way of describing the wear and tear that happens in our cells with exposure to certain external elements. So that process of extending shelf life so that that food can travel far diminishes the overall nutritional value. I happen to have a personal commitment to the environment. Many of you do as well, I'm sure. And think of what we call the food mile that is secondary to those blueberries coming all the way from Chile in January. Now, some of you are familiar with this time of year where we have eggplant, squash, tomatoes, zucchini, all kinds of fabulous summer vegetables in the Midwest, and then we get into that October-ish time where we get squash and the tail end of some of the other vegetables, and you may have in your family done some canning or put up vegetables. But basically, we were okay with eating what was in our neighborhood or from our region. And then suddenly we've gotten to this place where we want to have pineapple in the middle of the winter, or, as I said, blueberries in the middle of the winter. Nothing wrong with having a treat of blueberries, but if you had gone out last month to within 50 miles, there are 6 farms where you pick your own blueberries, and you go ahead and grab several buckets, eating a delicious bunch of handfuls on the way home, baking a pie, freezing some, so that in January you pull blueberries out of your freezer, and yes, they'll be a different consistency, but they will be more nutritious because they were picked fresh. They hadn't been changed in any way, so they could be shipped for 4,000 miles. So just wanting to offer that contrast about us in the United States as one of the sophisticated countries, that we are one of the few that eat foods that travel that very long distance. And it's just something to contemplate as to how important that really is for us to have those kinds of foods in the middle of the season. There are some concerns about eating processed foods. When I talked about the convenience factor, that tends to be foods that are put in a package that we either thaw and then bake, or we put into the microwave. Perhaps they're delivered to our front door in a cardboard box. We might pick them up in a sack through a drive-through window. There is nothing wrong with occasional convenience foods from time to time, but there are some people and many families who live on convenience foods several meals throughout the week. What we know about those convenience or packaged processed foods is that they have had chemicals added to them to preserve them or to help them maintain their color or shape or whatever it may be. And some of those additives, food dyes, etc., in the processing, they cause inflammation inside of our body. I'm sure other speakers have addressed the inflammatory response and its linked to chronic illness as well as its detriment to the aging process. So inflammation comes from many external factors, and there's even a genetic predisposition, and there's obvious external factors for inflammation. Obviously, if you smoke, or if you drink too much alcohol, or if there's a high glucose or diabetic condition that's not well managed, that would cause inflammation inside your body. But most of our disease states in America are related to our lifestyle choices, largely related to the kinds of foods we choose to eat and or our ability to stay physically active. So I'm very familiar with coronary artery disease, and when we're born, we have these lovely smooth artery walls, and then over the course of our exposure to life on planet Earth, including packaged and processed foods, the response to some of those additives and chemicals and such cause inflammation inside the arteries. Specifically, the cell wall itself begins to degrade. And as the cell wall degrades, it breaks down and is kind of rough and sticky, if you will, so that through the normal process of blood flow, which carries fat and minerals and such, that sticky, rough part of the cell wall will grab onto some of that fat, and that is the foundation for a plaque buildup. And then more fat courses through and minerals and catches on to that plaque. And then that plaque continues to grow over the course of the years. Some people make more plaque than others, but nonetheless, that inflammation inside the body is a direct cause of narrowing of the coronary arteries, which would ultimately compromise blood flow and could lead to a cardiac event or a heart attack. Leaky gut syndrome, have you heard of that? It's quite talked about now. One thing I love about studying nutrition and food is that the science of nutrition is very young, and we are learning so much now, especially in these last 5 or 8 years. And if you've been studying this at all, the gut health is the newest frontier for understanding why we in America have such a high incidence of chronic disease states, more so than any other countries. Your gut is the largest organ in your immune system. Leaky gut refers to inflammation that has occurred inside your gut system so that instead of a nice closed system which houses bacteria and aids in digestion and such, the gut itself begins to leak, and that bacteria flows into body systems where it's not ever meant to be, and that is being linked to Alzheimer's and many autoimmune diseases such as lupus and even multiple sclerosis. I think you'll hear more and more about leaky gut and or just gut biome, gut health, as the scientists continue to explore this. It's really quite fascinating. But processed foods with all those additives and chemicals and such are directly linked to that inflammation inside the gut. Food allergies. You may be aware that there has been a tripling of food allergies in adolescents over the last 20 years. 3 times higher incidence of food allergies now than there were in the late 1990s. That's pretty profound. The doctors and the scientists are studying this as well. I find it interesting that they're trying to link our obsession with hygiene. Now, of course, personal hygiene is important, but we've become so obsessed with the antimicrobial gels all the while, and of course we want to be, clean. But the scientists are thinking that children are so sanitized that they're not able to meet a germ that they don't have an inflammatory reaction to, which may ultimately lead to allergy. So that's one thing they're looking at. Another is our exposure to antibiotics, both at the drop of a hat in terms of a cough or a sneeze or a sore ear. Now, antibiotics, by the way, have a very strong place in our healthcare system. Clearly, it's an important modality to treat somebody who's truly ill. We'll talk more about antibiotics and food a little bit later. But we know, too, that processed foods with the, as I mentioned, food dyes and high fructose corn syrup and such create this inflammatory response, which may make somebody who is just a teeny bit sensitive that much more sensitive and create a full-blown allergy. So again, just to, for your consideration. Disease states, obesity. The United States continues to have epidemic levels of obesity. 14% of adolescents are diagnosed as obese. 35% of adults are diagnosed as obese in the United States, and upwards of 50% of adults are overweight. We know that obesity and type 2 diabetes is very closely linked, and that's a whole other topic, mind you, but there is that connection. Back in my cardiac rehab days, it was very common to have a client who was in their mid-40s, maybe 10, 15, 18 pounds overweight, wasn't very active perhaps, was sort of doing the convenience food model, and they would be diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, by the way, is very largely related to our lifestyle choices. So that client, if he or she were able to really stay devoted to moving their body on a regular basis and making wise food choices, they would no longer need type 2 diabetes medicines. I'd seen that many, many times over because that can be controlled with lifestyle choice. But that was sort of a middle-aged kind of disease. And now, over the last 10 years, we are seeing a rise in adolescents being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And that is because of their soda intake and their Gatorade intake and the fact that they're sitting around with their electronics all the while and not playing. Now, and I'm not holding any judgment around any of these pieces that I'm mentioning, but just to link in how what we choose and what we're exposed to really makes a difference in our overall health. If an adolescent is 40 pounds overweight and has type 2 diabetes, there will be an ongoing struggle for them to achieve good health status as they continue to mature. So the positive news is, let's eat. There are many wonderful ways to integrate good, healthy, and yummy foods in. I've developed over the years many guidelines, my favorite of which is I call the 80-20 rule. If 80% of your life is devoted to healthy food choices, where you're being mindful and intentional with preparation and with the foods that you're choosing to eat, then you have 20% of your life to live it up. Enjoy the splurge. please note that I use the word splurge with intention. I do not use the word cheat, as in when I hear a client tell me that, oh, I cheated over the weekend. We have a complicated enough relationship with food as it is to bring in some of those negative terms that has an effect on our relationship with food. So splurge is happy, it's joyous. So enjoy the splurge, whether it is an ice cream in the middle of a hot summer day or whether it's a grand slam breakfast after church on Sunday. Live it up and enjoy it, because 80% of your life is devoted to making healthy and wise choices. Hope that gives you some inspiration. Another guideline, 5 small feedings per day, or as I call it and many other food advocates call it, grazing. I know the word feedings is kind of weird when I'm talking to humans because you associate that with your livestock, for instance. But if I invited you to enjoy 5 small meals per day, that would likely lead to an overfed state. So a meal, from our perspective, is often a plate full of food. If we had 5 plates full of food each day, that would not allow us to manage our weight very effectively. 5 small feedings per day looks like a reasonable size breakfast, lunch, and dinner with a mid-meal snack in between the breakfast and lunch and in between the lunch and dinner. When we eat often throughout the day in small amounts, we are able to maintain a consistent blood glucose level, so that when we have a blood glucose level that is consistent throughout the day, it's very kind to our pancreas. The pancreas is the organ that kicks out the digestive hormone insulin that helps us metabolize our blood sugar or our glucose levels. So when our pancreas is happy, we are much less likely to develop type 2 diabetes down the road. When we eat small meals throughout the day, we regulate our hunger hormones and our satiation hormones, as well as our brain fuel and our productivity. So eating small amounts of food throughout the day allows us to be energetic and productive, as well as manage our weight effectively. There's a hormone called leptin. Have you heard of that before? Leptin is our satiation hormone. Again, quite fascinating that this is just recently in the 1990s been very more closely looked at by the scientists. Leptin is a protein that's made in our fat cells. It travels to our brain and it lets us know that we are well fed, that we are satisfied with the amount of food that we have had. When people choose to deprive themselves of food by going on either a low-carb eating plan, for instance, or a reduced calorie eating plan, especially anything below 1,200 calories a day, the brain gets very baffled and it becomes resistant to leptin. So it turns out that when people have, and I'm sure you've heard of this yo-yoing kind of effect, when people have dramatically cut back on the amount of food that they've eaten, their ability to recognize leptin in the brain is greatly diminished. So we sort of lose our barometer for when we've had enough to eat. Does that make sense? And then when you do begin eating again, when the diet is over, then you end up overeating, and that's where that weight gain comes back. The scientists had explored how can we isolate leptin and give it to people who are obese so that they have this giant surge of leptin to remind them that they are already satisfied. But it turns out unless it's made inside your body, that we just don't recognize a synthetic form of leptin. And the last thing I want to mention in regards to deprivation, when I really got into behavior change and understood brain chemistry and what happens when adults are told what to do, when your doctor tells you you should lose weight or else you're going to end up with high blood pressure, or your well-meaning spouse says, gee, honey, should you have that second piece of pie? Well, as adults, we tend to go into a fight or flight response, even though it may not be perceived overtly as stressful. Nonetheless, we don't like being told what to do. So when we get into that deprivation state, we begin to secretly long for and crave foods that we even cognitively understand may not be the healthiest choices, but we begin to long for them. And again, that's just another example of how we have a complicated relationship with food. I like to talk about planning ahead. Planning ahead can take two specific avenues. When you plan ahead to be well fed throughout the day with those small feedings, that does take a little bit of forethought, and I'm going to get into that in a bigger way towards the end of this workshop. But if you leave to chance that you want to have a mid-morning snack and a lunch after you've already had breakfast at home and you've left the house for the day, you are going to run into some options that may not serve your best intention to eat well, whether it's chips and crackers in the break room at work, or whether you end up going to, and I only say donut bank because I'm still new here, and it just amuses me that there's a place called Donut Bank and that you can drive through and walk and get away with, a giant box of donuts. So I'm not hitting on Donut Bank exclusively. I'm sure there's other donut places here in town. But when you're hungry at 11 o'clock and what you want really is a cup of whole milk yogurt, but in fact you didn't plan for that, it's just by happenstance that you'll eat whatever it may be in front of you. So planning ahead, again, we'll talk about that more. But balancing the day in terms of planning is also a wonderful opportunity. Tomorrow's Saturday. I hope you're going to be at a wonderful barbecue, and I hope that barbecue is going to have whatever your meat of choice is, and rolls and salads and beans and chips and maybe even beer and certainly pie. So you know that you're going to have a whopping good time tomorrow late afternoon at that barbecue. So planning ahead would look like being mindful of your choices earlier in the day so that your breakfast and your lunch and your mid-meal snacks are that much more conscientious in terms of the quality of them. Or something else I was going to say. Oh, yeah, the other example, and I love the Grand Slam breakfast, and that's a very popular after church family gathering at any of the big box restaurants here. Nothing at all detrimental to having a big breakfast with your family after you've had a social gathering, especially if it's a spiritual gathering. But if you have that breakfast, then you will want to think about your lunch and your afternoon snack and your dinner, just given that you're looking for that balance throughout your day. Drink lots of water. There's no such thing as too much water. Unless you have a diagnosis of true kidney disease, you can drink all the water that you want. Water keeps things moving through your system. It mobilizes your fat cells. It keeps your kidneys flushed out. People who lament that they have to go to the bathroom often when they drink too much water, your kidneys are rewarding you that way because you're keeping them flushed through. So the more water you drink, the more purified, so to speak, your kidneys are, and they're actually happy. And pardon me speaking of water. So why is it so relevant to focus on plant-based eating? Plants, by the way, are grains, beans, legumes, fruits, and vegetables. That is the plant kingdom. It's a marvelous, marvelous base from which you can choose fabulous food combinations. It's important because carbohydrates are the premier source of energy. Complex carbohydrates are found in whole foods. Complex carbohydrates metabolize or break down into glucose, and glucose is what allows you to move your body in the skeletal muscle sense, and it's the only fuel that crosses your blood-brain barrier. So carbohydrates are your friend. We have come full circle from where we were in the 80s and 90s with low carb or no carb. In America, when we went low fat, and again, I'll talk more about this later too, but we went low fat or no fat, we ended up ramping up in a big way our simple carbohydrates, our high fructose corn syrups, and our fillers and such, which are simple carbohydrates. And they ended up putting more weight on people, even though we were eating supposedly less carbohydrates and more protein and fat. So carbohydrates are back in favor, but remember that we're talking about those that come from whole foods and have not been simplified in the processing. Carbohydrates and plant foods are very high in fiber. Fiber is also a hallmark of excellent health. It's recommended that adults get 40 grams of fiber per day, and on average, an American gets less than 10 grams of fiber per day. We eat far fewer fruits and vegetables than we used to, but many of our grains are now processed and they have less fiber to them, and many people don't eat beans, period, or legumes. Fiber is important because it binds with cholesterol, which lowers your overall blood cholesterol level. And although it is not glamorous, and many people don't talk about it, fiber keeps your bowels regular, and really that's a good thing. The plant foods as well are chock full of micronutrients. The essential minerals, vitamins are present in all the plant foods in their natural state, as are antioxidants. When I spoke of inflammation, that is a simplified way of talking about the oxidation process inside your body. Oxidation is actually related to rusting, so just like a car would rust if it's exposed to the elements over the years, that same kind of rusting occurs inside of our body. That's called oxidation. So the plant foods are very, very high in the antioxidants, especially the colorful plant foods. There are lots of folks who talk about supplements. I happen to not be a fan of supplements, not only because I'm more one who leans towards eating whole foods and getting those micronutrients from the food source itself, but also because there's sort of some lack of integrity in the supplement industry, so that you don't always know what you're getting in supplements. And finally, supplements in isolation are not as well metabolized as when they're part of a whole food. So when you're taking just omega-3, for instance, but you don't have some of the other components that would come in a whole food that would carry omega-3, it's not as beneficial to us. So I'm going to always come back to being an advocate for eating those whole foods to get the most nutritional benefit. One example I'd like to give about glucose metabolism is looking at whole grain versus a slice of Wonder Bread. Now, I know probably nobody in here eats Wonder Bread, but imagine the contrast. So if you have a piece of true whole grain bread where it's a brown bread, not just caramelized brown, but really truly a deep brown, and you can see some of the seeds and nut pieces that are in that bread, and it's really a hearty piece of bread. When you eat that bread, it may take upwards of 40 minutes to digest. Over that period of digestion, your blood glucose is going to rise very slowly and evenly. Again, this keeps your pancreas happy. When you eat a slice of Wonder Bread, that processed food with very low fiber digests very quickly, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, which means that your blood glucose is going to rise much more quickly. Your pancreas then gets stimulated to release insulin so that you deal with that extra glucose that's in your system. And then after the insulin does its work, you crash. You end up with a lower blood sugar, and you feel like you need more carbohydrate, whereas those high fiber complex carbohydrates keep us full longer and help to regulate a blood glucose level. Any questions on that? So it's no surprise, I'm sure, to you to hear me encourage you to eat fruits and veggies. As I mentioned, in the United States, there is a fraction of adults that are taking in the recommended daily suggestion of fruits and vegetables. Most people don't come close to what is suggested. The good news is that you can have an unlimited access to vegetables. Eat as many as you would like. I like to talk about vegetables being eaten as close to the ground as possible, and by that I mean that in their raw state they have the most the highest amount of nutritional value. Raw vegetables don't always need to be eaten, but when you're having a salad, for instance, and you can chop in some, you can chop in some broccoli and cauliflower, carrots, and grate in some fresh beet, for instance, those raw foods will have so much more nutritional value to them. If raw chunky salads are a little bit distressing on your stomach until you get used to them, the next opportunity would be roasting vegetables. Anything roasted is divine. This has got a magnificent flavor to it. But when you roast vegetables to an al dente state, meaning that they're remaining crunchy, they're warm and flavorful, and they have a good retention of those nutrients. If you were to saute in a stir fry, for instance, again, keeping your vegetables crunchy, you're still able to get many of those nutritional elements. But when people boil or steam vegetables, much of the nutrition is leached out into the water or that hot steam. If you're going to use that liquid then for a soup broth, that's okay. But generally you want to try to eat your vegetables in that state of being close to the ground. Vegetables are, again, high in fiber, and they are considered one of the complex carbohydrate groups. Fruits, not quite as much. Fruits are actually a marvelous food. They have vitamins and minerals that are not found in other foods. But because they're not quite as high fiber, tends to affect your blood glucose just a little bit more. So I suggest, in contrast to unlimited vegetables, that fruit be just a little bit more moderate of an intake. An example would be with juice. If you drink an 8-ounce glass of orange juice, that is the equivalent to 4 oranges. And typically most of us wouldn't sit down to eat 4 oranges at any given meal, and yet to slug back 8 ounces of orange juice would be something that we could easily do with a breakfast. So consider a third of a glass of orange juice and then adding 2/3 glass of water to that juice, or pomegranate juice or apple juice, whatever it may be. That juice will still have that fruity sweetness to it, but it will have far fewer those carbohydrates available that are going to have an effect on your blood glucose. Grains, beans, and legumes. Adults are recommended to eat 6 servings a day. Even as a longtime vegetarian, I would say that 6 servings from those families is a little bit tricky. What I think is most important here is to look at the serving size that's recommended, 1/2 to 3/4 cup. Think about the last time that you were in an Asian restaurant, whether it's Chinese or Thai or whatever it may have been, and they bring that seemingly non-empty bowl of rice. Perhaps somebody at your table went back to that rice a few enough times that they may have consumed easily 2 cups of rice at one sitting. So that rice, first of all, is very likely a processed rice. It's not as hearty as a whole grain or brown rice might be. And 2 cups, which over the course of an hour meal you don't keep track of it like that. It may be easy to eat that much. But you can see the contrast to what's recommended in an individual serving. So again, just something to think about. I've always found that when I eat out, I will put food on my plate and then push away or what I don't wish to continue eating, and or ask the server to package it up so that I can take it home right away. You know how that is, right? When food is on your table and you're continuing your conversation, waiting for the water to be filled again or waiting for your bill to come, it's so easy to keep on picking and taking little spoonfuls, and then suddenly you go, you know what, it's not even worth taking this home, let's just finish it off. And you've eaten more than may have served you in the long run. So something to consider. Plants are a marvelous source of protein. I have been a vegetarian for over 40 years. I'm super energetic and healthy, and I have heard so many people say, oh, you can't sustain a vegetarian eating plan because you just don't get enough protein. And I'm living proof that that's not the case. And I'm not promoting vegetarianism, by the way. It just happens to be one way of choosing to eat. But we used to think that we needed these complicated combinations of having grains and lentils all in the same meal, or else we couldn't possibly get enough protein, and that is not true. The newer science of nutrition tells us that within a 24-hour period, if I have some cereal in the morning and then during lunch I have a little bit of a burrito with rice in it, those amino acids still work together to create the complete protein. So plant foods are, in fact, an excellent source of protein, and it's a misinformation to think that you must have dairy or meat to get adequate protein in our country. Eat a protein or a fat with your carbohydrates. I can see now, by the way, that the flow of this is a little bit off, so it's not laying out exactly how I had intended. When you eat a carbohydrate, as I mentioned, it is metabolized into a glucose, and the glucose is an excellent source of fuel. If you're looking to further enhance your moderation of glucose, you can add a fat to that carbohydrate meal or snack, because fats take so much longer to digest that they allow for a slowing down of overall metabolism, so your blood glucose level is going to be that much slower to rise. So instead of an apple for your snack, apple's a marvelous food, go ahead and smear that apple with some fresh ground almond butter, because that's going to give it a good healthy dose of fat that's going to slow down the metabolism. Or your mid-afternoon snack, as opposed to a handful of crackers, have a hard-boiled egg to go with it, because that fat will slow down the metabolism overall and allow you to regulate your glucose more effectively. I love to talk about a rainbow on your plate, or 6 colors on your plate as it relates to plant-based eating. Think of a salad. Salads, thankfully, have transcended the old iceberg, 2 slices of cucumber and 1 rock-hard cherry tomato. We don't see that very much anymore, which is a good thing. So if your salad begins with a bowl of greens, and that might be chard and kale and arugula and spinach and a little bit of Bibb lettuce thrown in, you've already got the green color in there. And then you add sliced purple cabbage, which is my favorite crunch in a salad, so thinly sliced purple cabbage. Then you have carrots and celery. Carrots are bright orange. You've got some grated or sliced red pepper. You top that with some grated beets. You've got raisins. You've got cauliflower. You've got broccoli. You've got some pumpkin seeds. So you can see we're up to 9 colors and haven't even entertained all of the plant kingdom for that salad. When your meal is colorful, you're just getting a whole lot of those micronutrients and those antioxidants. And in fact, the deeper the color of your plant food, the more beneficial it is nutritionally. That salad can also be converted into a stir fry, all those vegetables that I mentioned, or converted into a casserole, for instance. So it need not be in that raw state. But think of your plate of food being this beautiful rainbow color representing so many different foods. One of the topics I love to address is mindfulness around eating. And when we look at a beautiful plate of food that we are about to enjoy, and we take just a moment to admire its gorgeousness, that changes the way we're going to appreciate that meal as we're eating it. We're more likely to slow down a little bit and appreciate its beauty and its flavor. So the 6 colors on the plate has benefits beyond just the micronutrients. Consider meat as a complement to your meal. I know that in the Midwest, I'm on shaky ground here when I say this, but I am going to take a few moments to express my strong feelings on this one. The majority of meat that we eat in the United States, either on our own kitchen plates or in a restaurant or big box, that meat has very likely come from a factory farm. Factory farm animals have many health concerns associated with the quality of that meat. I mentioned antibiotics early on as the scientists are looking at food allergies and leaky gut. So 80% of the antibiotics used in the United States are used in factory farming. 80% of the antibiotics go to animals, cows, chickens, sheep, and pigs, and maybe even goats and buffaloes that are raised in a farming environment. That antibiotic exposure to the humans then that consume that meat is a worry. You've likely heard that there are super bugs out there now, super bacteria that is resistant to some of our old standby antibiotics. And the thinking is that that may very closely be linked to the fact that humans are exposed to antibiotics in ways we were never intended, simply because the animals that we eat have themselves been fed antibiotics. And they are given antibiotics preemptively because of their conditions crammed into these factory farm environments. Many animals are given growth hormones directly and or chemicals that have a secondary stimulant effect on the growth. So the farmers want their animals to get bigger, fatter, sooner, so they can go to market sooner, so they can bring in the next crop of animals and keep that going. Again, I want to be carefully treading here because some of you, especially in the West, there may be farming in your family, and I'm not trying to be disparaging, but the giant corporate agricultural approach to growing animals has an effect on the humans that then eat that meat. And if you notice the largeness of children now, both obese and tall, could that be related to growth hormone or growth stimulant exposure from animals, especially the way we encourage them to drink so much milk, for instance? It's very likely. The American College of Pediatrics is very concerned about that. Look at how young girls are hitting puberty at like 8, 9 years old now. You know, as an almost 60-year-old woman, it was like 14, 15 when I was growing up, and it slowly changed because growth hormone became such a staple of growing animals in a factory farm environment. I think that's a concern. As a food activist, I have some very strong feelings about genetically modified food. I'm going to step away for a minute from any potential DNA concerns around us eating foods that they themselves have had their DNA modified. I want to focus on the pesticides and the insecticides that are then sprayed routinely in huge amounts on those crops that have been genetically modified. We ingest then those chemicals, those additives of herbicides and insecticides, and that concerns me. There were some very early studies done in the 1970s that was funded, by the way, by the very companies that make these insecticides and herbicides. Those studies were done looking specifically at glyphosate, which is the ingredient in Roundup. So it was done in a vacuum, and they were looking at a short-term effect. So in fact, short-term effect, there seemed to be no overt response or dilemma reaction to exposure to glyphosate. But what about an adult who's had glyphosate in their food for 40 years? We have not done that science. We're assuming because a short-term study showed us it was okay, that in fact it's okay for our entire lives. I find that to be of concern. And there's no funding available anymore to do additional studies. The other piece to that is that glyphosate was the big guns chemical used back then. Now you know that weeds and bugs have become resistant to glyphosate, so they've added a whole bunch of stronger elements or agents into crop farming, and they have not been studied at all in addition to the earlier chemicals. So we don't know how they interact and how they work together. Could they be causing harm? We just don't know. Intuitively, it feels safe to me to minimize my exposure to chemicals. That's how I look at it. We don't know enough to just routinely trust the companies that make that stuff to tell us that it's okay. That's my strong feeling. what does that have to do with animals? Well, factory farmed animals are given a ton of supplement of corn and soy feed. 90% of corn and soy grown on this planet is genetically modified to tolerate the dosing from the chemicals. That means the animals ingest that grain, those chemicals get in their system, and then it gets into our system when we eat those kinds of animals. So how do we look at this as a balance? There are several farmers in this area within 70 miles that grow very happy and healthy pigs and cows and sheep and chickens. I encourage you to look into that, and actually I'll give you a link in just a moment. Those farmers sell a share of their animal. So you can buy a half of a cow or a whole cow if you have a large family. You can buy a weekly delivery of eggs from happy, healthy chickens that have not been dosed with these agents that I have expressed concern over. When we invest in those farmers, and the way a share works, whether it's a CSA share for produce or a share for an animal, you make an investment into that farmer, you pay a certain amount of money at the beginning of the season, and then every week or month, whatever your arrangement is, you get a delivery of meat. Or if you've bought a whole half of a cow, that cow is butchered by the farmer, and then you put it in your freezer, and you've got happy, healthy meat for the rest of your year even. So in America, we look at meat as the main attraction. And I'm suggesting that if we look at meat as a complement to our meal, if our plate's got a gorgeous supply of greens and a beautiful combination of lentils and grains and a 3-ounce piece of animal protein, we are going to be eating a well-balanced and very healthy meal. Those CSA shares for your animal are going to cost a few pennies more. When you go to Sam's Club and you buy a giant pack of steaks, think of the low price and wonder about the quality of that meat. How do they offer it so cheaply? Because it's been made and grown in this abundant state in a big economical market. And when you buy small amounts, it costs a little bit more, but you're able to eat less with your meals because you're focusing on the plants that complement the meat. Does that make sense? So it's a shift from how we're used to eating. I know when we go out and we can get a 12-ounce steak for $7.99, man, that is an amazing deal, right? But where did that 12-ounce steak come from, and why is it so inexpensive? So something to think about. I'm a big fan of whole milk dairy. That may certainly be contrary to what you've heard in the past. Back in, again, cardiac rehab days, late 1980s, early 90s, I taught American Heart Association, low-fat, non-fat. That's what we thought we knew. We now know definitively that animal cholesterol does not cause coronary disease. There is no link between cholesterol and blockages in the arteries. That has been adopted by the American College of Cardiology, and you look at some of that science. There was some flawed science, or some science that had some extrapolations of data back in the 70s, which is what led us to the low-fat, non-fat place of being with whole milk dairy. When they took some of the fat out, as I mentioned earlier, they added in sugars and some other fillers of simple carbohydrates because we like richness and satisfaction in our mouths and on our tongues. And low-fat, non-fat dairy, let's face it, it doesn't have that creaminess that we really appreciate. So they added stuff to make it seem creamy in our mouths. And that stuff has some health concerns. Also, low-fat, non-fat actually makes us feel less full and less satisfied with our meal or with that food choice. So a little bit of whole-fat dairy, be it cheese or yogurt or ice cream, cream cheese, whatever it is actually a very healthy choice. Clearly, if you sat down to a pint of ice cream or you had 2 cups of yogurt at any given sitting, that might be a little bit too much all at one time. But when you're moderating your volume, whole milk dairy product is definitely the way to go. A fan of saturated fats, particularly coconut oil and butter. Anybody using coconut oil in the kitchen? magnificent flavor. Love that stuff. I use it on all my baking now and a lot of my vegetables. Tastes wonderful. It's very exotic, and it has a goodly amount of the plant micronutrients in it. Sweet cream butter, delicious. Margarine is off the table, literally. There's some concerns with the way they've adulterated the fat and such in that. So butter is the way to go, obviously in moderate amounts. I like to promote the monounsaturated fats, olive, peanut, and sesame oil. Have a half of an avocado on your salad or your sandwich. I remember in cardiac rehab we used to teach 2 slices of an avocado. Well, what do you do with the rest of the avocado, until you eat it next time? So have a whole half of the avocado and enjoy it. And then grab a handful of nuts a couple times a day. Eat fresh, eat local. Feel free to jot this down, urbanseeds.org, urbanseeds, all one word, .org, and it does have an S on the end for seeds. That is a nonprofit. I have the pleasure of sitting on the board, and we have a mission of bridging the gap between local farmer and the consumer. So in the tri-state area, we have created a Eat Fresh, Eat Local food guide, which is on our website. You're welcome to look at that and download it. We look at the farmers markets, where to buy local food. There's only a couple of restaurants in town that have a focus on locally sourcing their food, but we highlight all the farmers and what they sell and how they cultivate their food and where you can get it. I already mentioned with the blueberries, for instance, that the closer you eat food to it having been harvested, the more nutritional value there is, so that's important. When we shop locally, we keep our dollars in our community, and that helps keep us strong as a community. There are now some amazing initiatives for urban farming, farming on rooftops, farming vertically in glass buildings. So there's a lot of young people that are becoming interested in farming. And if we can support the younger generation farming in ways that are sustainable and healthy, we will all be healthier because of that. As a food advocate, I have often talked about voting with your dollar. Where we shop and how we shop really speaks volumes, and it's a way for us to, as a consumer, express our desires. I know that with tendency for bigger families here in the Midwest, that stretching your food dollar is a very reasonable and understandable concern. So shopping at a big box store is something that we have been enticed by because the foods are cheaper. I think I've already laid the foundation for understanding that food that is less expensive tends to be lower in quality. A way to stretch your food dollar is cooking from scratch, believe it or not. When we buy raw beans and when we buy dried grains, those are so affordable. When you throw together meals, and I'll talk in a minute about how to do that, when you throw together meals that have a little bit of locally sourced animal protein and a ton of vegetables and other plants with that, you can feed a family of 4 for under $10 per meal. So that's economical, and yet many people don't understand that there's that benefit as opposed to a cheap bucket of chicken for $10. So to that end of food preparation, I have over the years been creating these teaching modules called 90 Minutes of Kitchen Zen. And what this is basically is giving yourself permission to take 90 minutes once a week to prepare your foundation foods so that you have the ingredients all ready to make meals even in your busy life. And those meals will be cooked from scratch. On my website, I've written extensively about Kitchen Zen, and there's also quite a ton of recipes there for you to look at as well if you're interested. The way this works typically is you have your meal plan, you have done your shopping to fit the meal plan for that week. If you can gather family or friends, neighbors even, that makes the experience that much more lovely, but certainly you can do this on your own. The idea is that on typically a Sunday, because that's when we often prepare for the coming week, you give yourself this 90-minute period to create these foundation foods. So you pick a grain, let's go with quinoa. You pick a bean, let's go with a kidney bean. And while those are simmering, you prepare your greens. So you've got your kale and arugula and spinach and Bibb lettuce. You wash them. You lay them out on a big beach towel, let them dry. While that's happening, you chop up your peppers and your purple onions and your zucchini and eggplant if it happens to be that time of year. Rub those with garlic-infused olive oil. Throw them under the broiler for about 3-4 minutes on either side. They begin to caramelize. They're just magnificent with that oil. Those foods then can be eaten on a sandwich. They can be put into a soup or a casserole. And I love roasted red peppers right out of the fridge. And make sure you keep that oil, by the way, because it's taken on the flavor of the vegetables and it's delicious. You can cook some protein. You can make up during these 90-minute period of time. You can boil your eggs for your salads. You can cook up a couple chicken breasts that you're going to eventually cut in half because you're focusing now on that 3-ounce portion. So during this 90 minutes with family and friends around with some good music playing, you are preparing these foods so that when you come home at Monday at 5:30 after a big day at work, having picked up the kids at soccer, instead of looking at a bag of dried beans and looking at some broccoli and cauliflower still wrapped in their cellophane from the store, you then pull out those grains and beans. You pull out your prepared vegetables and you mix them in a way with flavors that can go in any direction. So, for instance, if you take all your veggies and you add Kalamata olives and some feta cheese and red peppers, you can go into a Mediterranean, make that into a casserole or a soup, or you might go with salsa and cilantro and green onion and go into a Mexican flavor. So that 90 minutes that you've given yourself as an investment in your own health and well-being can get you down the road 3, 4, 5 meals. All those greens that you pre-washed, you've got your basics for salad, the celery, carrots, broccoli, cauliflower you've chopped. You can have salad 3-4 days that week for lunch, for instance, and you have your hard-boiled eggs and your chicken to put on top of them. So it's a mindset that allows us to invest that time so that we can eat well throughout the week. If that feels a little bit overwhelming, and I can understand, this is something that I sometimes take 2 hours to teach in more detail, but consider the Try It Tuesday concept, which means that once a week you're willing to try a new recipe. And that recipe could be vegetarian. I know there might be some people in your family who consider a meal to not be a meal unless it has meat in it. But perhaps once a week you might have the wherewithal to try a new recipe. And if it was plant-based, it would be a way of introducing something a little bit different to your family. And on becoming well-fed. Becoming well-fed is an activity and a goal that takes some practice and some awareness. When we are hungry, it creates a vulnerability. It's probably not ever happened to anybody here, but I know that I have gotten crabby when I have skipped a meal. Sometimes my attention span wanders a little bit. I'm a little bit dingy in the head, but I know that my mood can be affected if I don't have that level of glucose available. So you want to avoid becoming hungry and staying well-fed. Keeping yourself satiated, that's where eating often, grazing throughout the day allows you to have that constant sense of satisfaction. It takes our brains 15 minutes to recognize that our stomachs are full. So if we have gotten hungry and we are excitedly eating, the very first thing we get our hands on, we tend to eat all that's in front of us, and suddenly we go, oh, I'm so full now. When you eat more slowly and because you've been eating with intention, your ability to keep your brain recognizing that your stomach is getting full, those two are talking to each other more effectively, and there's less of a chance that you'll become overfed. And there's an emotional element, as I have alluded to. We often eat for reasons that have nothing to do with filling our stomach. Sometimes we're bored or lonely or angry or upset. So it's worthy to stop for a moment before we choose our foods and, am I really hungry, or is there something else going on? And that may allow you to change the choices you would have made. So when we are well fed with intention and have chosen foods that nourish us, we then do have the ability to meet that goal of aging with grace and ease. Thank you. And let's see. Oh, 11. We were supposed to be done 5 minutes ago. Pardon me for that. Any quick questions? Okay. Pardon me for that. And if you go to that website, heartmatters.pro, my email's right there. You're welcome to reach out to me in that regard. Thank you. Oh, good. Good. Thanks. So just leave this as it is, or